Today we got an interesting device to take a look at. Something new from Kinhank, the Super Console X arcade stick. This thing intrigued me as I kind of like the idea of an all-in-one retro emulation console built into an arcade stick, but I've never been much a fan of like Pandora's boxes or other options that were cheaply made. Like a lot of these things I've looked at, they've had rusted ass jagged metal or scrap looking plastic. Just the look and feel has been pretty bad. But this thing looks very similar to the 8BitDo arcade sticks, and it does seem a lot better quality than a lot of the previous products that I have used that are kind of similar anyway. So this console, it can double as an arcade stick for the PS3, PS4, Nintendo Switch, Android boxes, you know, Raspberry Pi, PC, all sorts of stuff. And it can also just be plugged in directly to a monitor, and you have access to over 23,000 retro games. So you can also plug in other controllers to this thing if needed for multiplayer action, or if you just don't want to use the arcade stick. And in case you wanted to see the inside, I did decide to do a quick teardown just so you could take a look. Doesn't seem too bad in there. Now, the weird thing is, I've been looking to find all the specs for this machine, but everywhere that it's sold, either they don't list the specs, or the websites that I thought had the specs before when I initially looked have been taken down, or they're not accessible for some reason at this moment. But digging into it a bit, it does look like this thing is using a fairly old board used for Android TV boxes. It kind of seems like the norm. So this has the Amlogic S905L board, which consists of a quad-core ARM Cortex-A53 CPU, up to 2 gigahertz, and a Mali 450 GPU. Not the most powerful thing in the world, but sometimes you may be surprised, and it could work out for what you want and need. So I wanted to go over my experiences testing this thing, you know, pretty much looking at all the systems, some of the quirks and annoyances that I found, maybe some of the stuff I like about it. I don't know. Let's just get into it. So we're running Emulec with a buttload of games. Pretty much everything from Atari 2600 and television up to Dreamcast, Thomas Wave, and Naomi, with everything you expect in the middle. TurboGrafx, Super Nintendo, NES, Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, and plenty more. Now, pretty much anything 8 and 16-bit, you won't have any real issues with. They play just fine. But there may be some things you want to figure out how to change, like controls. The default way that they had this set up didn't really work well in a lot of games for me, so I had to reconfigure it, and I did it globally. I didn't run into too many issues, but some specific games or consoles you may want to create unique configurations for as well. It also depends on the emulators that it's using, if it takes, you know, the global configs, that kind of thing. There's, you know, there's a little bit that you got to look into if you want to get the most out of this. So another thing that I quickly noticed was that they had smooth scaling turned on by default, and I don't like that, so I turned it off, and everything started to look way crisper. Now, there are a lot of things you can change per emulator for scaling, resolution, and tons more, but that's all beyond the scope of a review video for me. But you can change plenty of things within the UI while selecting games by pressing select and going to game options, advanced game options, that kind of thing. And if those options don't work for you, you may need to access settings within the game via RetroArch. Depending on your configuration for hotkeys, for what you have to press, you may have to press a couple buttons to get into the settings while in a game. For me, it's pressing select and X. An example of a system that I needed to change stuff for was Game Boy Advance, as it displayed way too small, so I changed it within the video options in RetroArch. Pretty simple, but I'd recommend not messing around with too many other settings unless you know what you're doing, have had experience doing this kind of stuff. But it is all rather simple and self-explanatory for, you know, video display and controller options if you need to change that kind of stuff. Now, like a lot of these pre-built systems, it's never a perfect setup, in my opinion. Your opinion may be different, but I'm only sharing my opinion. I don't know what your opinion is. It's my video, right? So I'm sharing my experiences. Take it or leave it type of thing. But a lot of times, you know, these things, they do seem like ROM dumps with little effort. That happens a lot, and while I don't feel exactly like that with this build, it still has some annoyances. Like I already stated, you may have to redo some controller configs and video options for some systems, which for a pre-made console built into an arcade stick, I'd love for, any of these companies to really put in the effort and optimize everything. Instead, it still feels a bit like a DIY project. But the other problems here consist of bad ROMs. With over 23,000 games, it's kind of nuts. So there will be games that just don't boot up at all, games that are missing audio, all sorts of little problems. Now, the ones that I mostly experienced with missing audio or, soundtracks were for PS1 games, and I'm sure it's just bad rips on those, but it's unfortunate. The first 2 games I decided to test on PS1 did not have music when they were supposed to have music. So, yeah, kind of crazy. Another thing I always look at with these kind of builds is individually if the system's game list is clean and presentable. A lot of these consoles will have no, metadata or snap art scraped. You just start kind of going through each system and you'll find a lot of, things just out of place. It's like, okay, everything else has artwork. Why do these games not have artwork or description, that kind of thing? It just makes it look a little sloppy. You can fix that stuff, but, it would be nice if it was just nice to begin with, right? Plus, you will find that the ROM list for all these consoles, there's over 23,000 games. It's padded out with a lot of duplicates. Mostly different region versions of games. I don't have an issue with multiple regions, but like, do we really, need to have, 10 different language versions of an arcade game or a Super Nintendo game to be on a game list? The other nitpick is ROM hacks all over the place, all over your face. I also don't have an issue with ROM hacks. There's tons of them out there that are awesome, but I don't like them intermingling with the standard console. ROM hacks should be in their own collection, and it's not that difficult either for in the set list for games for a specific console to separate the languages. Like if you want to put multiple language options of different ROMs, you can have a Japanese section. Whatever, a French section, whatever, you have the most games for each region, you can make little subsets of them, but here they're just all thrown together. Now, if you want to clean up the game list or add your own stuff, it is pretty simple on a Windows PC. Go to any Explorer window, click in the navigation bar, type in //emulec and hit enter. Now this works if you set up your internet on the console, either hardwired or via Wi-Fi. And if it asks for a password on your PC when you do this, the username is root and the password is emulec. Simple stuff. And you can get in there and start messing around with things if you want, if you know what you're doing. Now, to comment on specific console performance, this all feels fairly typical of a lot of devices I've reviewed on my channel in the past, a lot of these Chinese emulation devices. Now, like I stated, all your 8 and 16-bit stuff will perform just fine. But beyond that, it's a big meh. Like, what the heck? Very hit and miss. Dreamcast, Thomas Wave, and Naomi, all over the place on what is actually playable. Some may be playable in that they have no stutters or slowdown, but they'll have mad-ass graphics glitches. And some do just chug along and make it near impossible to play. You will find some games for all those systems I just mentioned that work well, but don't expect anywhere near 100% compatibility. Now, PSP is a system that they have a ton of games listed for it, but they are mostly PSP minis. There's a reason for that. Now, depending on the emulator and settings you use, you may get decent performance out of some more demanding PSP games, but not all of them. It'll just require a bit of tinkering with settings. If you're comfortable with that, go for it, but don't expect everything to work. The minis, for the most part, will, but any of the standard PSP releases, just never know. And that's really the point that I wanted to make. I think a lot of people go into these things hoping for a simple plug-and-play solution where they don't have to fuck with anything. And that's just not how these things ever wind up being, unless you just keep it to the lower end of games and consoles anyway. NES, Super Nintendo, you'll be fine. But okay, let's move on to Nintendo 64 real quick. So this feels like a broken record at this point. but it's a very mixed bag. Some games run like garbage, some perform decently well. With over 23,000 games here, nobody has time to test everything. So if you were interested, I'd go into it expecting bad performance for some of the higher end systems that, you usually hear giving people problems on these lower end devices. And, if you find something that you want to play, you might be surprised that it works well, but go into it expecting it not to, I guess is the best suggestion I could give. Now, another thing that I have to mention on this console as far as the game list that I actually think is pretty cool is we have a bunch of open Beats of Rage games. Now, I did test a few of them, and they're quirky, crazy games, a lot of interesting stuff, but they all perform just fine from the ones I have tested. So that's a bonus. If you like open Beats of Rage, a lot of cool stuff there. Now, overall, I think the idea behind this console arcade stick is cool. I mean, I like it over plenty of other options because the build quality is fairly decent, and it is a smaller solution that I can comfortably play. Don't need a lot of space for this. But the one reason I think this may not be for some people is because it is an all-in-one. You have to be tethered to a power cord and HDMI cable, so that can be limited. Having the console part separate makes it a bit easier to play these types of games in, various different settings. I mean, this particular device, it works fine if you're using it at a desk, but in the living room on your couch, maybe not as convenient. I feel I would like these types of things quite a bit more if the build they came with was more polished. Only stuff that works, emulators and controls pre-configured, and it just being overall more presentable with the game list. This one, it's not as bad as other builds that I've used. It really wouldn't take me much time to clean this thing up to how I'd like it, but it would have been nice not to have to worry about any of that. So there's my thoughts. Hope this video helped, gave you a good idea of what to expect with this device. Let me know what you think down below. Really do appreciate every single one of y'all. Catch you on the next one. Bye.